The following special episode of Addressing Gettysburg is brought to you without commercial interruption by our Patreon page. Just go to patreon.com/addressinggettysburg so you can help support the show and keep it going and growing. Just go to patreon.com/addressinggettysburg and help us help you. That's patreon.com/addressinggettysburg. And we thank you in advance. Now on with the show.
You're listening to Addressing Gettysburg.
Thank you. So good morning, everyone. And Jill, thanks for the introduction. I just want to say before I get started, just a huge thank you to Jill, Pete, and Ashley for inviting me. This is my first time back to Gettysburg, and I want to say 6 years, 5 or 6 years. I think so, maybe not. My sense of time is just so warped because of COVID, so perhaps I have it wrong. Perhaps I was here last year and I just don't remember it. But I appreciate all of you coming out this morning. If this talk doesn't go well, I mean, it looks like I can start with some science experiments behind me, so we'll see how things unfold. So I'm going to talk about Robert Gould Shaw this morning, a topic that I've been knee-deep in terms of researching over the last few years. I hope at some point to have a finished book manuscript, which should have been finished a number of times in the recent past. But I'm getting there, and I do find him interesting, and I hope you do as well. I want to start out with, of course, the movie we all know, Glory, released in 1989. That means it's over 30 years, and that means I've dated all of us in this room. I apologize for that, but it's hard to believe it has been over 30 years. It was a 30th anniversary re-release, or special release, came out a couple of years ago. It aired on Netflix, so it's still popular. And I think it's safe to say that probably no Hollywood movie has done more to shape popular understanding of a Civil War figure than Glory, right? We think we know the story of Robert Gould Shaw from watching Glory. It's beautifully done. It's still, I think, my favorite Civil War movie. It tells the story of the 54th Massachusetts, the first black regiment raised in the North in early 1863, and of course, the young officer who commanded it, Robert Gould Shaw. Played, of course, by Matthew Broderick, right? I mean, who actually, I think, pulled it off. But of course, the movie only tells us part of the story of Robert Gould Shaw. And it's a story that I think is distorted in some respects because, of course, other than that opening scene, the bloody scene set at Antietam, we're learning about Shaw as he interacts with the men in the 54th Massachusetts. Shaw almost comes, dare I say, fully formed by the beginning of the movie, right? He has a little bit of doubt about accepting the colonelcy for the new regiment, but off he goes. And by the end of the movie, of course, with his death at Battery Wagner in July of 1863, and the burial with his men in the trenches, the movie sort of, I think, reinforces that Shaw's purpose in the war has been fulfilled. His understanding of the cause of the war, or the purpose of the war, is merged with the purpose of the men that he led in battle. Now that, of course, I think is highly problematic. And what I want to do this morning is talk about that period in Shaw's life that most people know nothing about. And that, of course, is the period between roughly the summer of 1861 and the end of 1862. Most of Shaw's military career, of course, was spent outside of the 54th. He was an officer in the 2nd Massachusetts. And that's what I want to talk about today because, of course, I think that we don't really have much chance of understanding Shaw's experience during those final few months. Think about that. Only in command of the 54th for roughly 6 months, and in the field with the 54th for just a couple weeks before his death. He spent much more time, many more months, in the 2nd Massachusetts, and his understanding of the war shifted dramatically during that period of time. So that's what I want to focus on today. And I'll just make this final point before I get started, that I think because of Glory, we have the urge to look for a kind of ideological thread through the first part of Shaw's military career, something that points to his acceptance of the command of this 1st Black Regiment, whether it's based on the fact that he had parents who were diehard reformers and abolitionists, or any other factor. We think that there's something perhaps inevitable about Shaw accepting this command. And one of the things I want to sort of point out tonight, argue for, if you will, is that this is anything but the case. In fact, I don't think there really is much of anything that points to Shaw accepting command of this regiment. And I think that's worth understanding. But before we get to the war, a little bit of background. I'll just also point out the other aspect that has shaped our understanding of Shaw, of course, is the beautiful memorial in my current hometown of Boston, just across from the State House, the 54th Massachusetts Memorial, or the Shaw Memorial, dedicated in 1897. Just refurbished, beautifully refurbished. It looks magnificent, and I urge all of you, if you have a chance to come to Boston, make sure you include it in your itinerary. Now, Shaw was born on October 10th, 1837, a little bit of background, in Boston. He spent the first few years living at 44 Beacon Street, just a few blocks from the State House, atop Beacon Hill. In fact, just a few blocks from where the memorial is currently located. In fact, there are 2 large trees in front of the memorial, if those of you who have visited. Those trees were there going as far back as the 1790s. When John Hancock owned the property. And so I sometimes imagine a young Robert Gould Shaw sort of climbing those trees as a young boy as he was playing in the Boston Common. His parents, Francis and Sarah Blake Sturgis Shaw, Francis Shaw, were both from wealthy families. The Shaws, of course, made their family fortune as a result of overseas trade. In fact, Francis retired at a relatively early age so that he could focus his time on the many reform movements that he and his wife were involved in. And they were involved in, it seems like, if there was a reform movement in Boston, they were involved in it. Shaw had 4 sisters, Anna, Josephine, who they called Effie, Susanna, and Ellen. And the house was filled at different times with a who's who's list of reformers. William Lloyd Garrison, Lydia Marie Child, Theodore Parker, Wendell Phillips were quite often frequent guests in the Shaw home. So Robert Gould Shaw at a very early age is exposed to this kind of conversation, this talk of perfecting society, the importance of taking a leadership position in perfecting society. At a young age, roughly when he's 5 years old, the family moved to West Roxbury, very close to where I currently live, to take part in one of the many utopian experiments, this one being Brook Farm in present-day West Roxbury, neighborhood in Boston. They didn't live at Brook Farm. They lived close by, but Frank Shaw basically underwrote the experiment at Brook Farm. He offered to financially support the experiment, which did not last long. So although he didn't live at Brook Farm, clearly there's plenty of evidence to suggest that he did a little bit of schooling there, that he listened to talks, listened to, of course, concerts and other lectures about all of the various kinds of reform efforts going on within a society, a communal society itself. But within a few years, the family moved to Staten Island, and they moved in large part because Shaw's mother had problems with her eyesight. There was a doctor, a well-known doctor in Staten Island, and they decided to move to be near the doctor. Now, I should say, during Shaw's early schooling, he went to a number of schools, very good schools, one of them being present-day St. John's University in New York. He was not the most academically focused child. He was also not very interested in his parents' reform efforts. In fact, one of the earliest letters that I came across is Shaw writing to his mother. I think this is somewhere around 12, 13 years of age. He writes, "I don't want to become a reformer, apostle, or anything of that kind. There is no use doing disagreeable things for nothing." So a little bit of pushback, a little bit of perhaps teenage, if you will, rebellion on the part of Rob Shaw. To his parents' credit, they don't push back against him. They allow their children to talk freely, to arrive at their own conclusions. I think perhaps they gave a little bit too much leeway, as we'll see when it comes to the war itself, but you get the sense that these are very actively involved parents in their children's lives and parents that care a great deal. Now, in the early 1850s, the Shaw family traveled briefly in Europe. This is what wealthy families did. You did the European tour, and so that means that Shaw will spend part of his education in Italy, in Switzerland, and finally in Hanover, Germany. And that means, and it's the reason I have the map up here, that means that Shaw is not present, he's not here in the United States as the sectional crisis is deepening, especially, of course, by the mid-1850s. He followed the news, he listened to Europeans talk about the latest news coming out of the United States and the debate over slavery, specifically, of course, the Kansas-Nebraska Act. The fugitive slave controversies, especially in Boston, occupied a little bit of his attention. Boston, of course, was a hotbed of activity in this regard. One news item that did catch his attention was the lynching of a slave in Alabama who was subsequently then burned. The body was burned. That you find in his correspondence. But I don't want to exaggerate this. Shaw is, again, he's not the most intellectual. He's not so focused. He's having a good time while he's in Europe. When he's in Hanover, Germany, for example, he writes home to his mother, and I think this speaks volumes about peeping into the windows of young ladies and watching them dress. And what this says about his relationship with his mother, I just find that fascinating. And I'll be honest, I'm still trying to unpack that. I'm not quite sure what to make of that. Now, the family comes back in 1855, and of course, Shaw is going to attend, like his father, Harvard. He's tutored by future Union General Francis Barlow, who graduated a few years before. Barlow also, with his mother, spent a little bit of time at Brook Farm, but the two did not cross paths. Of course, he learned that his class had a duty to lead, to educate, to control, and to enlighten the uneducated masses. But again, education's one thing. Shaw was preoccupied with his social life. He joined a number of the social clubs at Harvard that are still around today, and of course, he enjoyed a little bit of partying with his friends that he lived with, and sports. There's not much evidence that he took much of an interest in the widening debates or the deepening debates over the issue of slavery. Shaw ends up leaving Harvard a year before his graduation. He did not graduate from Harvard. He was directionless, as far as I can tell. He contemplates at one point moving west to become a farmer. Imagine what his parents thought of that. He thinks about a career in the military. He's not quite sure what he wants to do. And again, his parents, you get the sense that they allowed their son the room to figure it out on their own. He ends up moving to New York City in 1859 to work in the family business, Henry P. Sturgis and Company. And he's absolutely miserable. It's clear that he's not going to be a businessman like his father. And his father, of course, did not set the best example by retiring from business at a young age. So he's got to figure out what he wants to do with his life. Of course, the presidential election of 1860 looms overhead for Shaw, for everyone else. He does vote for Lincoln in 1860, but he was not deeply ideological or political. He certainly took part in debates and conversations among his friends and family, but he is, I think, focused mainly on his career. He's trying to figure out who he is and what he wants to do with his life. Slavery, I think, for this young man is a distraction, although, of course, he does hope at some point that slavery is abolished. Here's what he says just prior to Fort Sumter, the firing on Fort Sumter in April of 1861. He writes on April 5th, "As for making concessions, it is only patching the affair up for a year or two, when it would break out worse than ever. At any rate, we should have this same row over again at every presidential election. And if we give them an inch," meaning the South, "they would be sure to want thousands of ells, as is provided by their history and ours for the last 50 years. Indeed, they would not be content with anything less than a total change of public opinion throughout the North on the subject of slavery, and that, of course, they can't have." And I want you to listen to these words closely, because we're going to come back to them at the end. "I have been a disunionist for 2 years, But as there seems to be no way of making a peaceable separation without giving up everything, I am glad for the credit of the country that they will probably act now with some firmness. Let's figure this out. Let's move on. Let's get on with our lives. That is sort of the concern for Shaw. But the reference to being a disunionist, the possibility of allowing the Confederacy become independent, I want you to keep that in mind as we continue. Now, about this time, Shaw started training with the 7th New York Regiment, one of the elite militia units in the country at that time. It is upper class, so he is training with people, of course, of his own class, right? How serious this was, it's hard to gauge, but they did, of course, practice marching. How much drilling along those lines, you don't really get a strong sense of. But after Sumter, Shaw and the 7th was one of the first regiments to enter Washington to protect it against a possible threat from Virginia. So Shaw's first time in Washington, D.C., given that you don't get a sense of, a strong sense of union, preservation of the union in his letters, you have to imagine that Washington at this time did impress upon him the importance of preserving the Union. He met with Lincoln. He interviewed Lincoln at one point with a friend. He met Stanton, a few other people in high offices in government. And he writes this on April 26. He's only there for 30 days, I should also point out. That evening, we marched up to the Capitol and we were quartered in the House of Representatives, where we each have a desk and easy chair to sleep in, but generally prefer the floor and our blankets, as the last 8 days' experience has accustomed to us hard beds. The Capitol is a magnificent building, and the men all take the greatest pains not to harm anything. Jeff Davis shan't get it without trouble. Troops from New England are quartered all over it, but we have the best place. My desk is on the Republican side of the House. I have no doubt we are the best behaved Congress that has been in session for a good while. So he does, of course, experience the Capitol for the first time. He meets, of course, men from other parts of the country. No doubt this gave him a sense of sort of a broader purpose that they were involved in, coming from Massachusetts. But again, he was only there for 30 days. It's a 30-day enlistment or commitment. And Shaw quickly comes back to West Roxbury, Boston, and starts training with the 2nd Massachusetts Volunteer Infantry, commissioned as a lieutenant, 2nd lieutenant in Company H of the 2nd Massachusetts. The war for Shaw is a personal affair as well as his family. His relatives, Henry Sturgis Russell, George Russell, served with Robert II. Friends, Charles Morse, Richard Carey, Wilder, Dwight, Stephen Perkins, Richard Chapman, Goodwin. All of these men are names you'll sort of see in his correspondence. All Harvard people. We talk about the 20th Mass as being the Harvard Regiment, but the 2nd Mass has every claim, I think, to that mantle. This was Shaw's social network. These are the people that he will rely on. These are the people who understand him, that he can share his views on any number of topics with. They come from the same background. They train, interestingly enough, at Brook Farm. Not much left of Brook Farm by 1861, but of course, this is familiar ground for Shaw, given that he spent a little bit of time as a younger boy. And of course, he's preoccupied with training. The citizen soldiers who enthusiastically filled the ranks early in the war came from all walks of life. They were protective of their rights as individuals and suspicious of authority. Volunteers were expected, as one historian writes, to forego their survival instincts, their democratic prerogatives, and even their sense of individuality in ways that often seemed unnatural to them. So officers like Shaw had little time to prepare men for battle, but needed to tread carefully. Even if he believed that his Brahmin upbringing, as well as his family name and education, alone justified military rank and a position of authority, trial and error was the order of the day. Command forced Shaw to wear many hats, from motivator and instructor to disciplinarian. He needed to be able to quickly resolve conflicts and manage damaged egos. Shaw's success depended on whether he could treat his men as equals and on whether he could find and maintain that delicate balance between expressing sensitivity and interest in the welfare of his men when appropriate, with the expectation that assignments would be carried out and his orders obeyed without question. This is a man without any military background, so of course he's learning off the cuff. Now, to give you an example of how Shaw sees the military and the men serving under him, he writes on May 25th of 1861, "We have a good many Irishmen in our company who are very hard to manage at first, but they are getting toned down by degrees. We are filled up with Americans, and yesterday got 16, every one of whom was above the average both in height and muscle. We have a great deal of fun with the sentinels at night, for they very seldom can remember the form of challenge, and the Irishmen seem sometimes utterly unable to learn or understand anything." So Shaw does not like the Irish. That comes out clearly in his letters. But what I think is important here is to keep that in mind in anticipation of the black soldiers that he's going to command. Shaw viewed the world as a natural hierarchy. There were certain people born to command and lead, and other people were born to follow orders. And so I think that comes out early on, and I think is kind of a theme that we want to follow if you follow Shaw into 1863 when he assumes command of a black regiment. Now, at first, the unit is assigned to Nathaniel Banks's corps of Major General Robert Patterson's Army of the Shenandoah. They are first stationed in Harper's Ferry, which is significant, beginning in July of 1861. 2nd Massachusetts was stationed in the Valley and its vicinity for the first year of the war. Shaw's time in the Valley had a profound influence on his understanding of the war. His encounters with runaway slaves forced him to consider emancipation and even the possibility of African Americans serving in the Army as a wartime goal. It's interesting that they're first encamped at Harper's Ferry. We all know the significance. We can all imagine what his parents expected him to write about, visiting Harper's Ferry, perhaps inspired by being on this sacred ground where John Brown attempted to begin the end of slavery. That's not what they got. On July 18th of 61, Shaw writes home, "I saw John Brown's prison this morning and the place where he was executed. The slaves here seem well cared for, but they are evidently glad to see us." Then he writes a few weeks later, "We used the engine house where John Brown defended, which John Brown took possession of, for a guardhouse, and there are 3 or 4 loopholes which he made to fire through, and marks of musket balls on the walls inside. It seems to be the worst place he could have chosen to defend against and attack. For when the doors are shut, it is like a brick box, as all the windows are high up, and his loopholes are so small that they give no range at all to the men firing through them." Fascinating. You can imagine his parents being a little bit disappointed by this, right? No talk, no discussion, no reflection on Brown as a man, Brown as the abolitionist. Instead, Shaw is focusing on whether or not the engine house was the right place to defend. Was it defensible? I think that had to have been a slight disappointment, at least, to his parents. What Shaw is preoccupied with during this time is discipline. When you read his letters early on, that is all he seems to care about. And if there's a setback, a military setback, or any other type of setback in the regiment, it has to do with discipline. Elite officers like Shaw embraced punishment as a means to maintain discipline and orderly behavior among immigrants and roughs, who it was believed could not maintain self-control and did not possess the manly qualities necessary to win the war. A wide range of punishments were instituted for transgressors by their officers, including confinement to the guardhouse, the assignment of extra duties, to suspension by the thumbs with the entire body pulled off the ground, tying to a barrel, and of course, gagging. Shaw rarely shied away from sharing the details of how soldiers were disciplined in his own regiment and elsewhere in his letters home. He described the tying of a soldier to a tree branch, quote, by the thumbs about 15 feet from the earth, as an example of fearful torture. He responded angrily in a letter addressed to his sister to a story in a Boston newspaper claiming that the men of the 2nd Massachusetts, quote, are treated much too severely by the officers. For Shaw, punishment was necessary to reinforce a wayward soldier's sense of duty and suggested that such imaginary wrongs conveyed in newspapers often worked the discontented ones up to the rebellious points. Shaw wanted his family and others back home to acknowledge that victory would not come about if the volunteers could be shaped into a fighting force that was prepared for all the challenges of military life. I mean, the War Department brought Shaw to a boiling point when on August 3rd it issued an order allowing the men of each company to elect all officers as high as captain in the event of a vacancy. Shaw and his fellow officers feared the implications of this order for a number of reasons. It raised the very real possibility that men would be elected for reasons that had little or nothing to do with their qualifications for a command position. The attempt to instill some sense of democratic values through the election of officers threatened Shaw's sense of entitlement and social standing within the Army. And Shaw would certainly have agreed with Major Wilder Dwight's assessment, quote, "Today our Army is crippled by the ideas of equality and independence which have colored the whole life of our people. Men elect their officers and then expect them to behave themselves. Obedience is permissive, not compelled, and the radical basis is wrong." Now, of course, being in the Shenandoah Valley, at some point Shaw is going to come across or have to deal with the issue of slavery more directly. The enslaved population of the Shenandoah Valley at this time was roughly 25,000, 20% of the population in 1860. Under the terms of the First Confiscation Act, most fugitive slaves were ordered to be turned away or returned to their masters. And Shaw would have agreed with his fellow officer Henry Comey, who struggled with this policy because no human being should be owned by another. Few of the officers and men of the 2nd Massachusetts had ever interacted with enslaved people, and this is a crucial point. Their impressions of African Americans in slavery were informed by books like Uncle Tom's Cabin, certainly the case for Shaw. And certainly these men were impacted by the sights of enslaved people with their scarred backs and other physical reminders of slavery. While there is little doubt that Shaw would be moved by the plight or could be moved by the plight of the enslaved, he really didn't share much of anything about confronting enslaved people in the Valley. There are a few references. One comes on March 28th of 1862, and it's fascinating. He writes, "We were laying in the sun on the side of a hill, and 4 or 5 Negroes who had come up, in their Sunday clothes to see the soldiers passed along. Among them was a white man with 2 little curly-headed boys, all these as handsome people as you would find. Harry said, quote, 'That's a white slave.' So we called to him and asked what his trade was. 'Nothing, sir,' said he, 'but working in the field under another man.' I asked him if his father had lived on the same plantation that he did, for he said he was born there. I guessed what the answer would be, and he said his master was his father, and that it had often been a bitter pill to swallow, when he had been badly treated by him to think that it was so. He said it was, quote, like having a fork stick into him, or a forked stick in him." So he does share some of these stories, but Shaw is not sort of moved enough by these stories to see the war as a war primarily to end slavery, right? These are stories that he conveys to his family, that he certainly discussed with his colleagues or comrades in camp, but they come and go, right? It's not a consistent theme by any stretch of the imagination in his letters. But what's interesting is that he does arrive by August of 61 at the possibility of enlisting black men as soldiers. And we can make too much of this, but I do want to sort of explore it just briefly here. And it's in large part because of this man, Major Robert Morris Copeland, another Harvard man, ended up on the staff of Nathaniel Banks at one point, but an abolitionist right from the start. And I suspect that Shaw and Copeland started talking about slavery and abolitionism and other topics, even going back to their training at Brook Farm. On August 6th, he writes to Sidney Howard Gay, a family friend and newspaper editor in New York. This is what Shaw writes. He says, "Isn't it extraordinary that the government won't make use of the instrument that would finish the war sooner than anything else? vis-a-vis the slaves. I have no doubt they could give more information about the enemy than anyone else, and that there would be nothing easier than to have a line of spies right into their camp. What a lick it would be at them to call on all the blacks of the country to come and enlist in our army. They would probably make a fine army after a little drill, and could certainly be kept under better discipline than our independent Yankees. A couple days later, he writes to his family. Mr. Copeland told me he had a long talk with General Banks about making use of the Negroes against the secessionists. I thought it was a waste of breath, but we hear today that Banks has offered him a place on his staff. This is important, which shows that he thinks a good deal of his opinion. Copeland's sole subject of thought now seems to be slavery, and he is always fuming and raging about it. It's interesting that Shaw, in a sense, is looking at this, I think in part, as an opportunity. From the very beginning of the war, Shaw is focused on ways to advance his own career. Hearing that Copeland has received a positive reception from Banks and perhaps others, I think he probably found encouraging. This is perhaps a way to advance his own place in the Army, someone who is still trying to advance himself, find a purpose, if you will. But still, I don't get the sense that this is the abolitionist in Shaw emerging. It has practical value. Recruiting enslaved men or free blacks will benefit the military balance sheet for the United States. In May of 1862, Shaw and Copeland actually traveled to Washington, D.C. to talk to Stanton about possibly raising a regiment. Shaw accompanied him, probably did not attend the meeting with Copeland, but he does write, "You will be surprised to see that I am in Washington," he's writing to his parents. "I came down with Major Copeland to see if I could assist him at all in a plan that he has made for getting up a regiment. He says very justly that it would be much wiser to enlist men in the North who have had the courage to run away and have already suffered for their freedom than to take them all from the contrabands at Port Royal and other places along the seacoast of South Carolina. Copeland wants me to take hold of the black regiment with him. If he can get the permission to raise it, he offers me a major's commission in it." There's your military advancement. Copeland thinks the raising of black regiments will be an era in our history and the greatest thing that has been done for the Negro race. He is very enthusiastic about it. Notice what Shaw doesn't say. I am very enthusiastic about it. He doesn't say that I believe this will be the greatest thing for the country. And I think that is significant. Now, the regiment doesn't see much fighting in 1861 at all. They skirmish a little bit. They almost arrive at Ball's Bluff in time to help out with that disaster. Perhaps, who knows what would have happened if they did, but that's another story. So they don't actually experience the battlefield directly, and that leaves Shaw plenty of time to socialize with his friends. That network that I am arguing was absolutely essential to his own sort of mental health in the Army, in the regiment. Again, these men shared everything. November 1861, the 15th, he writes, "We have had a cold, rainy, and intensely uncomfortable day, but I have a nice little stone fireplace in my tent with a pretty high chimney outside, which makes it draw finely and keep the tent warm and dry. In this camp, mine happens to be one of the successful fireplaces they often smoke, so that I have had company all day. We have been from reveille until tattoo, talking and reading, and having quite a nice time. Stephen Perkins, Rufus Choate, Captain Savage were the guests. The latter is one of the best men I have ever known, and at the same time, he is one of the best officers and a real brave fellow. One of the rarest articles to be found is a pure-minded man." A few days later, Thanksgiving, he writes, "Besides all the turkey and geese, they had nearly 1,200 pounds of plum pudding. The officers' dinner was at 5 o'clock, and we enjoyed ourselves very much. Our mess tent was gorgeously lighted with candles, bayonets serving for candlesticks, and the dinner was excellent." Just imagining all these young men sort of sitting around this table, trying to recreate, perhaps, that experience that they would have had if they were with their families. Now, Shaw does, of course, finally see the battlefield, experience the battlefield, but not until the following May of 1862 at the First Battle of Winchester. He is almost wounded, perhaps even killed. One of these stories we've heard how many times, where a watch deflects a ball from penetrating. So he does survive. The regiment defends the outskirts of Winchester before it's chased through town, and it's a skedaddle back up toward the Potomac River. They're fired upon by citizens of Winchester as they retreated through town. But he does survive, and Shaw does accept a position on the staff of General George Gordon. So all this is happening, of course, as events are unfolding both in the Shenandoah Valley, but of course around Richmond. We'll jump ahead to the sort of failed attempt on the part of McClellan to take Richmond. Right after that moment, I should say right before that, of course, we know that Lincoln creates that new command for General John Pope, and Shaw's regiment is assigned to the Army of Virginia. And I'm going to sort of jump ahead, but just to say about Pope and Shaw, Shaw attempts to sort of walk a fine line with General Pope, because on the one hand, Pope is issuing these orders that are considered harsh in terms of how civilians are treated in Virginia and elsewhere. We know how Robert E. Lee responded. But for Shaw, it was, again, an attempt to walk a fine line, because on the one hand, the experience being chased through Winchester, his broader experience with civilians, he seems to arrive at a point where he believes that harder war policies are going to be necessary, but not as far as Pope wants to go. Because for Pope, of course, the danger, as Shaw viewed it, was that his policies would create chaos, that this would result in an undisciplined army run amok. And that's everything that Shaw was attempting to control as a young officer going back to their training at Camp Andrew at Brook Farm. But of course, we know how that unfolds after Second Manassas. Pope is out of the scene, and the regiment ends up back in the Army of the Potomac. But before that, of course, as Lee, after the 7 days, is attempting his own offensive operation, Jackson, of course, pushes north, attempt to get around the Union Army, around Warrenton, around Manassas, and confronts Banks at Cedar Mountain on August 9th. That's Winchester. There's Pope. There's the map. And there's Cedar Mountain, of course. And that, for Shaw, is really the first bloodletting. And I'm just going to read a few sort of excerpts from Shaw's letters, because they are quite telling. In my mind, I think we commonly sort of think about his decision to accept command of the 1st Black Regiment as his turning point in the war. I no longer think that. I think this is the moment for Shaw that is a critical turning point, this phase between Cedar Mountain and Antietam. Two major, of course, bloodlettings, and I'll try to explain why. First, Shaw estimated the regiment was under fire for no more than 30 minutes at Cedar Mountain. The results, of course, were deadly. The 2nd went into the battle at Cedar Mountain with 474 men, and of these, 120 were killed and wounded, along with 37 missing. Of the 22 officers, these are Shaw's friends, only 8 came out unscathed. These are all his friends, close buddies. This is what he writes a few days later. I was with the 2nd Massachusetts, having been ordered to show Colonel Andrews where to go. The first thing I noticed upon coming out of the wood was the immense number of bodies lying about the field. And then I saw a long line of rebel battalions drawn up opposite and almost concealed by the smoke from the pieces. Yesterday, I went over the battlefield with the general. The first man I recognized was Carey. He was lying on his back with his head on a piece of wood. He looked calm and peaceful, as if he were merely sleeping. His face was beautiful, and I could have stood and looked at it a long while. Captain Williams we found next, then Goodwin, Abbott, and Perkins, all in a row. All his friends, of course. The bodies were taken to town, and Lieutenant Francis and I had them packed in charcoal and go to Washington, where they will be put in metallic coffins. I took a lock of hair from each one to send to their friends. The next day he writes again, just playing over and over in his mind. The fact that many men get so accustomed to the thing that they can sleep among heaps of dead bodies, many of them friends and acquaintances, without any particular emotion, is the worst of all. I long for the day when we shall attack the rebels with an overwhelming force and annihilate them. May I live long enough to see them running before us, hacked to little pieces. I think Shaw's, that network that I've been emphasizing, that Shaw, I think, needed while he was in the regiment, begins to fall apart. These close friends that he had confided in throughout this period that were falling, beginning to fall in battle, as will happen, of course. And of course, it doesn't end, right? The next month, the unit fights at Antietam. And I went down there yesterday morning early to scout out the places where the 2nd was in action. 2 places, one during the height of the battle for the cornfield, during the early phase of the fighting, and then a little bit later, in an attempt to support Sedgwick's retreat out of the West Woods. The 2nd and a couple other regiments attempted to sort of approach the Hagerstown Pike and are sort of fired upon by Rhodes's men as they made their way to the fence line along the Hagerstown Pike. And that just adds to the tally. So just a few shots of some of the men in the 2nd Massachusetts, some of the men who are killed between Cedar Mountain and Antietam. And I think losing so many of these friends, I think also sort of undercuts his own connection, or begins to undercut his own connection to the regiment. Someone who I think by this point is closely sort of tied to the regiment and the men that he's serving under. As these men keep falling in battle, I think that gets, it's not as strong as it used to be. Now, I think this is also a difficult period for Shaw because he is coming into conflict with his parents over the issue of emancipation and McClellan. They're in conflict over any number of issues. McClellan, from the beginning of his command, Shaw and his parents are feuding about because on the one hand, family are Republicans, McClellan, of course, a Democrat. His position on emancipation is pretty clear. It's not or should not be a war aim. His parents, of course, see the war in providential terms. That's what the war is about. It will only have meaning if slavery ends. And that's not how Shaw sees it. And so he attempts to explain to his mother especially over the course of the next few weeks. And it doesn't quite work. He writes at one point, I should say, let me just find it. He says, "For my part, I can't see what practical good it can do now," Shaw wrote to his mother. "Wherever our army has been, there remain no slaves, and the proclamation will not free them where we don't go." So it's a practical concern. What good is it going to do? It's not going to advance us in any military sense, right? It's just going to, in fact, for Shaw, it's going to lead the Confederacy to impose their own policies that are harsher policies on Union prisoners, right? And so what happens, of course, when they start recruiting black soldiers? The Confederacy, of course, responds by threatening to execute or sell captured black men into slavery. So it's going to unravel the war for Shaw. It's going to move it away from that kind of limited war that he would prefer into something much more chaotic, something he is much more uncomfortable with. We don't have Shaw's mother's letters to her son, but of course his own letters give us a sense that he is trying desperately to sort of encourage her or remind her that he's not abandoning his abolitionist principles, but that he has to deal with the reality of the here and now. And a third time he tries to respond. I think it's out of love and respect for his mother. He attempted one more time to explain himself and to offer her reassurance. This is what he writes. "You must," I think this is fascinating, "you must have thought from my late letters that I was degenerating sadly from the principles in which I was brought up. But an ordinary mortal must be somewhat affected by his surroundings. And events which you look at in one way from a distance often seem very different when you are in the midst of them. The man at a distance is more apt to be impartial." I think Shaw wanted his mother to understand that he had not abandoned the anti-slavery principles that were taught to him as a child, but that his immediate surroundings and responsibilities, in a sense, had clouded his judgment. He hoped that she would take a step toward him in appreciating the environment in which he now found himself and remain confident that he would eventually find his way home. And I think that remains a rift between Robert and his parents. Now, after Antietam, we know McClellan doesn't move. We know he's eventually sort of removed from command entirely. They come to blows over McClellan as well for the obvious reasons. But the question of whether he should stay in the second comes up again, much more so, I think, because those connections have been severed in the regiment. It's perhaps easier for him to begin to think about some kind of movement into another regiment, another responsibility. He has an opportunity to join a new Massachusetts cavalry unit that's being raised at this point. But he writes still to Effie, he writes this to his sister, a man is or should be very loath to leave a regiment in which he has gone through as much as we have in this. I have had a great many discontented moments when I have thought I wanted to change. But when it came to deciding, I never went, accepting on to Gordon's staff, and then I was delighted to be back. So for the point now, for the moment, Shaw's going to remain in the second. Of course, Burnside takes command after McClellan's removal. He is not, of course, excited in any way. Most people are not excited about Burnside's appointment, I gather from his correspondence. The Army, of course, as you all know, eventually is moved toward Fredericksburg. The 2nd Massachusetts is not part of that movement. They eventually are encamped at Fairfax Station, where they hear about the disaster at Fredericksburg in mid-December of 1862. And that brings us to the end of Shaw's experience in 1862, but not without a final reflection. And I want us to, before I read this, I just want to remind us of sort of where he starts out in the spring of 1861 with sort of imagining an independent Confederacy, right? Or allowing the southern states to go. Remember, he sort of self-identifies as a disunionist at the very beginning of the war. He's seen so much, you perhaps hope that he has evolved in certain ways regarding the purpose of the war, but I think by the end of 1862, this is a disillusioned young officer. Not quite sure how the war will unfold. I think weary of the Emancipation Proclamation, which is, of course, on the horizon, questioning what his own place will be in the Union Army, whether it will be, whether he will remain in the Second Mass or take another position. It's just not clear. And I think that lack of clarity in Shaw's own mind leads him to write to his sister right around Christmas, a few days before Christmas. He writes this to Effie. When I first read this, I was just, wow, this is just so, it just sort of opens up, I think, our understanding of Shaw, where he is at the end of 1862, and sort of, it's an interesting place to sort of end because we all know what's going to happen in a few weeks in 1863. At least I hope you do. This is what he writes. He says, they say that Uncle Abe is on the verge of lunacy. I don't wonder at it. I am afraid now there is a danger of the government backing down. I had rather stay here all my life, though in this case I should pray for a short one, than give up to the South. The most satisfactory ending to me would be to have them brought to their knees and then kicked out and allowed to set up for themselves within certain limits. I would have them hemmed in on all sides by free states and not allowed a chance of extending. I find that just fascinating. Shaw must have known that his parents would read or at least hear about the contents of the letter, and he may even have anticipated their disappointment. After reassuring his mother just a few weeks earlier that he had not abandoned the abolitionist principles, the question of emancipation appeared not to be of any concern to him. Shaw was willing to see the war end with a defeated Confederacy left to govern itself with slavery still largely intact. His conviction that slavery could be contained by a cordon of free states harkened back to his embrace of disunion at the very beginning of the war. Perhaps Shaw recognized that this was an untenable position and simply used the opportunity to vent his frustration. I don't know. But I'll leave you with this. Regardless of whether Shaw acknowledged it or not, the scope of the conflict had exceeded the scope of the conflict had exceeded his hope for a limited war by the end of 1862. The war would soon assume a revolutionary character in the new year, one that would continue to undermine the institution of slavery, in part through the recruitment of African Americans into the United States Army. The only question that remained was whether Shaw would embrace and contribute to achieving these new wartime goals. That's a real question. And I leave you here with the image, of course, Massachusetts Governor John Andrew, who had been sort of pushing for the recruitment of black soldiers from the beginning of the war, and then, of course, has that very opportunity in early 1863, and contacted the Shaw family to offer their son the colonelcy of the 54th. Frank travels to Virginia to bring the governor's offer to him personally, and I suspect that he had doubts as to whether or not his son would accept. And as many of you know, at first he did reject the offer, but then quickly, of course, agreed to take on the assignment. But I'll leave you just with my own sort of confusion still as someone trying to understand this, that there doesn't seem to be much of any trajectory toward this point that I think perhaps many of us assume must exist. And I think that says something interesting about how I'm learning to think about the Civil War and its evolution, that the effort took people from all walks of life, right? I think today we unfortunately are too quick in sort of dividing or moralizing history. You either focus on 1619 or 1776, right? We want to sort of pigeonhole historical figures. And it's much messier than that. It's much more confusing than that. And it took people from all kinds of backgrounds to end up sort of pushing the country toward that point that I think all of us are happy it achieved, right? That it achieved the end of slavery. But it didn't have to happen. Nothing was inevitable. And I think Shaw's experience in the first half of the war sort of reminds us of that he found himself trying to understand a changing war, finding a place in it, and then ending up in a place that probably he, in the beginning, thought was just going to be very unlikely. So I hope I didn't talk too long, and I hope there's time for a few questions. But thank you for listening and being here.
For a more in-depth discussion with this speaker, go to patreon.com/addressinggettysburg.